This is the third video for AP Environmental Science, Chapter 5. This last section is looking at the limits on population growth. So why is the world not full of a population of rabbits, for example? Okay, and so one of the things that we have to remember is that resources are available in very limited amounts. They are fixed amounts of resources available on the earth. And when resources are abundant, that means populations can grow. And usually they're going to grow at a fast rate. When resources decline, the resources that are available usually are not distributed equally. And so that's going to result in increased death rates and decreased birth rates in populations, or sometimes both. And that population is going to start to decline. And sometimes that's going to go below carrying capacity, which I'll talk about in a minute. So for this particular section, make sure that you know the population change equation, which I'll talk about in a minute. Age structure, what that means. We'll talk about that a lot with Chapter 6. What are limiting factors? Population density, carrying capacity, and then these three things. J and S curves are mentioned a little bit in our textbook, but not as much as I would like for them to be mentioned. And then definitely R and K strategists and survivorship curves are not specifically talked about. So I'm going to do another video after this to explain these three things in more detail. So I'll go to that in a little bit. All right, so remember, populations are living together, and usually we find them living in different ways, okay? Ways that they're typically dispersed or spread out in an area or in their habitats. The most common way is clumped, which means we see species together in a pack, in a herd, a school, a flock, okay? And there's different reasons for that, so just make sure you're aware, which it talks about at the beginning of the section. Sometimes we find them spread out uniformly, and again, make sure you go over that and look at reasons why. And then sometimes they're found just kind of randomly spread throughout the habitat. And so a lot of that would be mostly things like plants. And again, it has to do with, for example, what we talked about with the island biogeography lab. You know, how do plants travel? Plants, or how do seeds travel? They're carried by insects with pollination. They're carried by birds or other animals as they eat the seeds and they poop them out someplace else. Or they're carried by the wind, and where they land is totally random. All right, so going back to the population change equation, again, we're going to see this a lot with Chapter 6. But remember, there are four things that kind of regulate or govern the change in a population size. So that's going to be births, deaths, immigration with an I, meaning individuals moving into a population. So think immigration in, and then emigration, which means individuals are exiting the population. So E for exit, I for in. And so a population is going to increase with birth and immigration, and then a population is going to decrease with death and emigration. So when we're trying to figure out how the population is changing, we have to look at what are the two things that are going to increase the population, what are the two things that are going to decrease the population, and then figure out the difference between the two. So fairly straightforward equation. All right, so an age structure is just looking at the distribution among age groups in a population. So the number of babies, for example, the number of adolescents, the number of organisms or individuals that are in the pre-reproductive stage, and then the number of individuals that are in the reproductive stage or able to reproduce, or those that are too old to reproduce, so they're at the post-reproductive stage. So those are age structures. Again, it has to do with reproduction. Who can't reproduce, who's too young, but will reproduce later in the future, who is currently reproducing, and then who can no longer reproduce, so that means they're not going to add any new individuals to the population. All right, the next thing to talk about with this chapter, or with this section, is looking at, ecological tolerance, or what your book is talking about as range of tolerance. Now here they're showing fish, but remember this concept of ecological tolerance is going to apply to all living organisms. And that's talking about the range of conditions that an organism can endure before injury or death is going to result. So, for example, we can endure being exposed to a range of cold and hot temperature. It might not be comfortable. It might make us sweat, or it might make us shiver. But we can endure a fair temperature range before we start getting sick from that exposure, or potentially die from that exposure. Okay, so that's an example of ecological tolerance. So conditions are things like temperature, salinity, or amount of salt, especially if we're talking about water, the flow of the water, or the flow rate of the water, because that's going to deal with adding oxygen to water. That's also going to deal with how things can travel. Water flows across gills and things, but primarily oxygen. And then, of course, sunlight. So remember that ecological tolerance, or range of tolerance, can also apply to an individual organism or also to an entire species. And so this is something also that we look at in the eco column labs. So moving on, excuse me, to the next part is the limiting factors. And limiting factors are the things or the factors that are going to limit the size of a population. We're going to talk a lot this year about things such as algae blooms. And algal blooms, a limiting factor is going to be the amount of phosphorus, because phosphorus is primarily found, as we talked about with the phosphorus cycle, is primarily found stored in rock, and it takes a long time for that rock to weather and erode, and for that phosphorus to get back to where it can be used by living organisms. So that's a limiting factor for population size. And so that's why when there's a lot of phosphorus in the water, either from fertilizers or from detergents, that's why we start to see algal blooms, and they just start to reproduce and grow like crazy. All right, moving on to the next page. Now remember that population density is looking at the number of individuals in a population found within a specific area. Okay, so looking at not just the number, but how densely packed those individuals are in that particular environment. All right, here it's talking about the reproductive patterns. I'm going to cover it in more detail in a different video, so I'm going to skip over that for now. Looking over here, remember that no population is going to just continue to grow. There's always going to be eventually sort of a cap or a ceiling for the size of that population. So you need to understand J-shaped curves and S-shaped curves and how those apply to population growth. So carrying capacity is defined pretty much as the maximum number of individuals in a given species that a particular habitat can support. So resources, places to live, water, food, all of those things. Those are all in a fixed amount. And so that's going to be what's available for that particular species in that environment that they can be supported with. So there's a cap to that. Remember, we said earlier that if resources are abundant, then populations can grow very quickly because there's a lot of resources available. Well, when a population is new or small, there's a lot of resources. So we tend to see very fast, rapid growth, which is referred to as exponential growth. Okay, and I'm going to use this graph right here. Okay, so exponential growth right here, if this is looking at the number of individuals in the population, in this case it's looking at sheep, over here or down here on the x-axis it's time, the individuals, the population size is really, really small. Lots of resources available, so that means that population is going to grow very, very quickly. So it looks kind of like a J, which is where the name J-shaped curve comes into play. Well, what happens is that population continues to grow and gets bigger and bigger. Eventually, it's going to pass the number of individuals that the environment or that habitat can support. And then you're going to have, that's called population overshoot, because it's overshooting capacity. Then you're going to have what's called die-off, meaning that population is going to start to crash a little bit. It's going to go below carrying capacity, and how that happens is you have individuals in the population dying off because of either food, lack of food, so starvation, or sometimes because the population is too dense, so disease can spread through quickly. But whatever the reason is, the population decreases, starts to crash, resources become scarce, and it drops below carrying capacity again. And then now again, we've got resources available, so population starts to build back up. There's a little bit of overshoot, and then same thing happens. Population decreases again. And so it continues to kind of bounce up and down around the carrying capacity line. So this right here is a slower growth over time, and that is referred to as the S-shaped curve, because you have sort of this wiggle line right here that's kind of like a sideways S. So J-shaped curve is this part here, the exponential growth, and then logistic growth is the one over here, which is looking at the overshoot, the die-off, and then the rebound, okay? So when we see carrying capacity, and I'll talk about it again in this next video, make sure you're able to describe what carrying capacity is. Know that usually carrying capacity in equations and things is identified with a K. When population goes past its carrying capacity, it's called overshoot. And remember, you should be able to identify what are the impacts of overshoot. A big one, of course, is going to be resource depletion. All right, the last part, which again I'll talk about in more detail or give more examples in the next video, is remember that available resources are going to impact population growth. So those are the limiting factors. And there are some limiting factors that are going to depend on the density or size of the population, and those are called density dependent limiting factors. There are others that are density independent limiting factors, meaning those things are going to impact the population regardless of if it's a population of 10 organisms or a population of 10 million. They'll have the same impact. Okay, and then the last part is just kind of looking, looking again and making sure that you're able to kind of talk about population crashes, sometimes referred to as dieback. So why does that happen? Why is it happening when a population exceeds its carrying capacity? And again, it has to do with that overuse of resources.